the generation of politicians running the world right now is not very prudent, very wise, and is not leading us to safety. We're in an extraordinarily dangerous time, and that is not intrinsic to our circumstances at all, because we could view, with the same conditions that we have, we could view our situation as wonderfully promising, exciting, a time when the whole world could be achieving very big things. We could understand, which we don't yet, that we are not in a game of who's number one or who's ahead or who runs the world. We're all blessedly stuck together on this planet, and we're all going to have pretty much the same outcome, either a good outcome or a disaster. And the old ideas that it's really important who sets the rules and really important who wins the wars are very outmoded. And they're outmoded for two fundamental reasons. One, we just can't go on with the kind of wars that we have and that threaten our very survival every day, because we are in the nuclear age and we have conflicts among nuclear powers that threaten our very survival. This is something new in history. We were, as a species, one could even say, we seem to be very prone to war, and war has been part of human existence, but things are different now. Actually, one of the wonderful lines of President John F. Kennedy and his speechwriter Theodore Sorensen, which I like so much, are his words from the inaugural address when he said, for our times are very different. We hold in our mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And that was 1961. This remains our most significant issue, which is we are so close to disaster every day because we are not properly led and because our ideas about the international order are way out of date. Now, the second reason, as I mentioned, of the two is that we're so interconnected now that the whole idea that there can be winners and losers on a completely interconnected planet really makes no sense. Maybe it made sense and it was immoral before, but now it really does not make sense to think that there's going to be a way on a planet with so much interaction every day, with complex global scale interactions and with the climate and environmental stress that is potentially disastrous for every part of the world, that somehow we're going to be able to do well while half the world is struggling to survive. And that is an old idea. In fact, one of the old ideas, quite disastrous, which actually came from England in 1798 of Thomas Malthus, who was very clever, so he posed a real problem. He got the wrong answer, but he posed a real problem. He basically said there's not enough to go around, so we're condemned to poverty, if not at all times, at least any time we are able to lift our head above poverty, we'll be driven back down to poverty by population increase, and we'll never really be able to surmount subsistence. And Charles Darwin had an aha when he read the Principles of Population and said, aha, that's where natural selection comes from. It comes from the fact that there are always more organisms than can be supported in their physical environment. And that was then taken by others further and said, well, that's our struggle for survival on this planet as human beings. And as nations against nations, or as races against races, we're in a struggle for survival. And that is social Darwinism and its even more extreme versions. This idea is wrong, and it's wrong for understandable and identifiable2 that would take a long time to discuss fully, but suffice it to say, 2 peculiar things that Malthus got wrong. He thought that richer people would have more surviving children because children would survive in a higher income context, and therefore there would always be, above subsistence, a survival rate of children that would increase the population. But what he didn't foresee was modern contraceptives and changing culture so that at higher incomes people have fewer children. In fact, they don't even have enough to replace the adult generation in the high income world. Fertility rates are now in many places, each mother having on average, or each 10 mothers having 7 daughters that will replace them in the next generation, meaning a declining population. So he didn't understand that, and he didn't understand the benefits of technological advance, because that was about to explode after 1798 in ways that he didn't envision. But the legacy of that idea is that we're in a struggle, and it's us or them. And of course, the worst horrific vision of that was Hitler's, which is that we need living room, Lebensraum, because otherwise the German Aryan people will not survive. So we need to conquer the lands of the Slavs to the east. And that was a real idea, by the way, that he picked up from German scientists who had picked it up from social Darwinists in this country, who had picked it up from Darwin, who had picked it up from Malthus. And it's actually a set of ideas. It's not just insanity. It was a set of ideas widely circulating among German social thinkers and among German scientists, in fact, in the early 1900s. Well, thank goodness it's wrong. We're not in a struggle between the US and China. There is no basis for this. We're not in any intrinsic war between the US and Russia. And Russia, by the way, despite every single thing that's said every single day, truly, really does not want more land. It's already 11 time zones. The last thing that they need or want is more land. The war is about completely different things than everything you and I read about in our newspapers every day, because our newspapers are telling us stories that ultimately come back to narratives conceived in the US Defense Department and the CIA, and that are completely bogus. So, what about this international order? The international order is extremely dangerous because we're packed to the gills with nuclear weapons. We are at a brink of environmental disaster. We are led by, to put it politely, well, I need to put it politely, but leaders who are not quite up to the challenge we face and are not properly addressing the challenge. And personally, it's a little bit of a relief for me to be here, because yesterday when I was at the Oxford Union, I could only think about Boris Johnson being president of the Oxford Union. And here I can think about Keynes being president of the Cambridge Union. I feel so much better and so much more at home in that regard, although I loved the event yesterday and Bojo wasn't there. But he was there in spirit in my remarks, because he's an example of one of the most disastrous politicians of our age, and has done a profound disservice in the world and continues to be a danger for all of us. And I don't say it lightly, and I don't say it in a partisan way. I just say it that people like that are extremely dangerous in how casual they throw around our lives. So the question, and I'll sit down in a moment so we can have a discussion, the question, could we have an international order that is peaceful, secure, ordered, improving the well-being of people around the world? The answer is absolutely yes. Is that what we have right now? The answer is absolutely not. Do we have the makings of what it could be? My answer has been for most of my professional life, yes. We could make the United Nations actually fulfill its purpose. That's why I have devoted the last 25 years to the UN in pretty much volunteer work every day, because I think it's our best hope for making a global order that truly is what we want and need. It's not working right now. It doesn't make me cynical. It makes me worried. It makes me sad, because I think I can see why it doesn't work. It was set up in 1945 so that the great powers would have a veto, and that is certainly the single most debilitating aspect of the UN, because if we had a system where the General Assembly, as flawed as it is, actually had enforceable legal remit, if you look at the decisions of the General Assembly over the years, they're actually very, very good, and the world would be a lot better place if it were guided by that rather than by the great power vetoes. So all of this is to say, I don't think we're so far from a vision of what we could have. Of course, we just had a Summit of the Future at the UN, which put forward a lot of ideas for UN reform that are very good, so we can reform what we have. But I think the idea of an international governance system that is based on peace, sustainable development, and human rights is really a good and smart one. And it's not so far from implementation, except we need, in my view, the main job that I feel is trying to help my former students and friends and colleagues and teachers in Washington get real, so that they understand that we're in a different world and that we do not need U.S. leadership at all. What we just need is U.S. decency and cooperation. So that's all I wanted to start by saying. Thank you for the question, and we'll get started.
Thank you so much for that. I thought that was really fascinating. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask a few questions for this next little bit of the talk, and then after that, I'm going to open it up to questions from anyone in the audience. So I just wanted to start dialing things back a bit towards your sort of academic background in development. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think it is, since 2008 in particular, and continuing towards today, that foreign aid has lost ground in the conversation in a lot of Western countries, particularly in the UK, where we've reduced it down to 0.5% of GDP? What would you say is behind that, and why is there a reluctance to accept the importance of foreign aid relative to changing government structures in developing countries?
Yeah, great. I trained as an economist in international finance, actually, not in development. And the greatest influence on me then, and I would say until today, was John Maynard Keynes. Not so much his macroeconomics, though I loved that when I first learned it. I thought that is the coolest thing in the world, that you can turn the dials and get the economy to operate and stay at full employment, and you could solve the model to know how much the dial should be turned. I mean, it was so much fun, and I loved it from the first moment. But what really influenced me was the economic consequences of the peace in 1919, which is Keynes's remarkable essay, as a very unhappy, disgruntled member of the British delegation to the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. And of course, the whole book was saying what you, Lloyd George and Clemenceau and Woodrow Wilson have agreed in the Treaty of Versailles is going to create chaos. Inter-allied debts, war reparations is going to create chaos. And of course, Keynes proved to be prophetic in that. And he said in 1919 that by imposing this harsh peace, this Carthaginian peace, the monsters would arise in the next generation with a vengeance that we couldn't even imagine. The quotations are marvelous because he was also such a great writer and such a great stylist. But he called it right, and it made a huge impression on me. And so I started out in finance, and when I began to be active in problem solving, and that came because some former students of mine in Bolivia came back to the campus at Harvard and said, we have a hyperinflation. And it was a very good moment in my life because these Bolivian students, former students, called the faculty to come to discuss the Bolivian hyperinflation, and I was the only one that showed up. I didn't know anything, but anyway, thank goodness the ones that really knew something didn't show up. So I had my shot. And I think there was another senior person, but I stood up in the middle of it and I said, that's actually not how hyperinflation works. You know, I knew all the theoretical papers, so I wrote something on the blackboard, and a voice from the back of the room said, if you're so smart, you should come to Bolivia. And secret, I had to go home to look on a map where Bolivia was. I had no idea. I was pretty sure it was in the Americas, but I didn't really know where it was. And then I found out, and I decided that I would go. And in any event, Keynes really influenced me because I got there and was an impoverished place and was at the time the 7th highest hyperinflation that had occurred on the planet. There have been several more since then. And I was able to use standard monetary economics to end the hyperinflation. And as soon as it ended, then the IMF said, okay, now Bolivia has to start paying debt that it hasn't been paying up until now. And I said, no, that's going to blow up this beautiful stabilization. And look how poor these people are. Let them go. Let them get on with things. And Keynes said, don't be mean. Don't be vindictive. Be nice to people that are in need. And I ended up, because I found a wonderful senior gentleman in the IMF who took me under his protective wing because I didn't know what I was doing. I was a kid. To all intents and purposes, Sachs is right. Why don't we try to forgive some of this debt? And in the end, Bolivia got a big debt relief, and the stabilization held, and that was good also for me professionally, because then many other countries said, well, help us get rid of our debt, which I did over the coming years, including in Central Europe and the former Soviet Union after the revolution of 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, and that's how I got involved in Russian and Ukrainian issues back then. But my idea all along was be nice to people in need, because otherwise things come back to haunt you, and when you're very rich, you don't even notice. I mean, Bolivia's debt was nothing. And by the way, the whole developing country debt was quite manageable if it was viewed in a decent way. And I was also schooled in Winston Churchill's not exactly correct saying about the Marshall Plan, that it was the most unsorted event in history. And I believe the Marshall Plan was a completely altruistic, wonderful act of the United States after World War II to rebuild Europe, and that's how I was raised and how I was taught. And in fact, it's much more complicated because it was a Cold War instrument of policy, and there's a lot of dark side to it, and it helped to fund the CIA operations, and it did many other things, so it's not a completely unsorted act, but it was an effective act anyway, and it helped to restart the European economies. So all of this is to say, I believed, what's wrong with a little transfer from a very rich world to poor people? And I basically believed that all my life, and I've tried, for a long time, I tried to raise development assistance. And I worked with Bono in 2005 at Glen Eagles that make poverty history, and we're going to get aid up to 0.7%, which was the UN standard that every rich country should give 0.7% of its aid, and so on. And I wrote The End of Poverty in 2005 based on the idea still, be nice, come on, we're rich, help poor people, it's a trap, get them out of the trap, then they can go on with their own development. It's not all charity, just it's a little bit of helping to overcome this extreme condition when you're poor, so you have no money to invest in the things that would make you not poor. So there is a trap, and it still applies to many places in the world. And if it's not literally a trap of poverty, if poor countries can find their way out, they could find their way out much faster and with much less suffering and with much more productive lives if we helped. So I worked on that for a long time. But over time, I discovered a lot of the deep, dark truths of American foreign policy that I did not appreciate, did not understand growing up. I knew things weren't right because I marched against the Vietnam War in the 1960s as a high school student, and I was never, but I did not appreciate the darkness of much of American foreign policy and British imperial policy and Britain's cheerleading of American foreign policy. And that grew on me over time. Plus, it's a little complicated, so it's actually worth just explaining one thing. In operant conditioning, when you're conditioning a rat to press a lever, or you're conditioning a human being to press a button to do something, if you want to decondition, take away the stimulus response, you can go cold turkey and then the response doesn't work, and there is fade out over time. But if you give a victory every once in a while still to pressing the lever, it prolongs the agony of phasing out the conditioning for a very long time. And I mention this because in my career, every once in a while, the US would do a nice thing. And so I came to believe that if I was persistent enough, I was pretty persuasive and I could always convince them to do the right thing. So there were a few successes along the way and lots of frustrations, but the few successes just made me absolutely sure that one more conversation, one more debate, one more argument with another president or a secretary of state or his advisor would be enough to turn the tide. And it took me a long time to stop pressing that lever because there's really a lot of nastiness. And I stopped going to Washington and talking about development aid in Washington probably about 10 years ago, I would say. Imagine we're not in 19th century Britain ruling the seas, which was a basis for British hegemony in the 19th century. So he says, and I say to him, China's not able to defeat us. The only risk we face from China, the only risk we face from China is nuclear war. So stay away from nuclear war. Stop playing with Taiwan the way you're doing. Sorry, it's stupid. Stop provoking things. And footnote, we provoked the war in Ukraine. I could go on for about 8 hours on that, and maybe it's worth 5 minutes, but we provoked the war in Ukraine, absolutely surely. And we'll do the same with Taiwan, and we'll lose any war that happens, but maybe the world will end also over this stupidity. And the people in Washington are stupid, I'm telling you. I know them. This is not my surmise. And I just read an unbelievably stupid article in an unbelievably awful journal called Foreign Affairs by, what's her name? First name I don't remember. Carlin is her second name. Oh my God. It's about how we have to prepare for the next war. I don't think the word diplomacy is mentioned one time. So the first thing is, John says, Professor Mearsheimer says, yeah, China can't defeat us, we can't defeat China, but China could annoy us, and it will annoy us more if China's the hegemon of East Asia, so we have to prevent China from being the hegemon of East Asia so that the United States is the only hegemon in the world, the only regional hegemon. What a thing to do that could provoke nuclear war. And I said, but John, that could lead to war between the US and China. Yeah, it's actually likely. Or it's possible, he says. Maybe we could avoid it, but it's quite possible. He said, no. You take the expected value of total annihilation, it's got a big negative sign. It's minus infinity as far as I'm concerned. And so you don't do that. You don't put any positive probability on something like that. So this is the first point of disagreement. The second point of disagreement is essentially about game theory. Everyone here knows the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a situation where it pays to cooperate, but the dominant strategy for each player is to not cooperate. Because if the other side cooperates, you cheat and you win. And if the other side doesn't cooperate, you certainly don't play the sucker. And so you end up non-cooperative, and you're off to the races in war. And that's game theory, and that's what's taught at Rand, and that's what these people in Washington think, and that's how they play, and that's how they talk. And the fact is, though, you put real people, and I mean non-economic students, real people, into an experimental game, and they cooperate half the time, 3/4 of the time. And then, wonder of wonders, you let the two people talk beforehand. Not to make a binding agreement, just to chat. Hey, why don't we both cooperate, for example? No signed contract. In game theory, that's called cheap talk. It should have no effect on the equilibrium. But in real human practice, if you put two normal people in a prisoner's dilemma game, they cooperate half the time. If you let them have pre-play communication, they cooperate more than 90% of the time. They're human beings. So my advice is, hey, why doesn't President Biden or somebody that actually can function as a president in the future actually talk to President Putin? You know, actually understand President Putin's point of view. Why is this war going on? Discuss it. You know, cooperation could rise enormously. There's a second point of game theory, which is very important, called the Folk theorem, which is that if you're in repeated play of the prisoner's dilemma and there's no set terminal date, then you should cooperate so you don't mess up trust of the two sides, because you're playing also against future actions. And you want to show, I'm trustworthy, you're trustworthy, we can gain from cooperation period after period. And that's another way to sustain the good outcome in a prisoner's dilemma. So I view international relations theory, realist theory, as essentially being the prisoner's dilemma or the Hobbesian dilemma of nation states in an anarchic environment. And my argument is it's not so anarchic, it's not so threatening. The only real threat is nuclear war, so stay away from that. That's the bright red line for all of us. And cooperation is just not so hard. And I look to many examples in history where cooperation worked. And I wrote a book in 2013 about one such episode because I found it completely amazing when I learned about it. And that was the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when, first of all, Kennedy rejected the advice of all his advisors except one, because they all said, go bomb these sites in Cuba. And now, in retrospect, we almost surely would not be here talking today had we gone on to do that. But Kennedy was very much more cautious, and he spent all the days of the crisis asking, what's going through Khrushchev's mind? He's a human being, what's he doing? And he finally came to the realization, this is not meant by Khrushchev to be the end of the world. This is not meant, we can both pull back. And that's what they ended up doing. And then that was October 1962. And in 1963, Kennedy made a campaign for peace that led to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was signed with the Soviet Union in July 1963. And it culminated, I think, in Kennedy's assassination because there were enough people in the US government that didn't like his peace initiatives. And so I think it was an inside job. And I think the evidence grows all the time that it was. But in any event, Kennedy's idea was the two sides can make peace. And when he said that, and he said it in the most beautiful terms, and his speechwriter was a gifted person named Theodore Sorensen that I got to know, luckily, because he lived in our neighborhood when I came to Columbia University, and I got to know him. He said in the most eloquent and beautiful words imaginable, we can make peace, even with the Soviet Union, even at the height of the Cold War. And he said it so beautifully that when Khrushchev heard the speech, he immediately called the American envoy, Averell Harriman, and said, I want to make peace with your president, because he was inspired by the words, actually. And they made peace. And that treaty lasted, and it led to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty 5 years later. It changed the world. And so that's the optimistic side. Go for peace. Instead, this awful president of ours, when he could function still, he was terrible. Biden. All he could do was insult Putin every moment. How are you going to make peace if all you do is throw insults at the one who heads a country with 6,000 nuclear warheads? This is crazy. It's reckless. And the whole place in Washington is filled with these people who are playing game theory, who know just what Putin's going to do, who know we have no alternative but to increase our military. This woman, Carlin, who was a senior official under Biden in the Defense Department that wrote this article, says we have no choice but to deter through building our military. She doesn't even mention the idea that there could be diplomacy with China. This woman's an ignoramus, I'm sorry. I've been to China 100 times at least. There's no intrinsic battle with China, none whatsoever. China's not out to defeat the US. It couldn't do so in a million years anyway. We'd all perish. And China's never, by the way, even once invaded a country overseas. In its whole history of 2,245 years, since 221 BC, when the Qin Empire unified China, did they ever invade Japan? Not once. Did they ever invade Korea? Not once. Did they ever invade Vietnam? Yes, 17 years in that 2,000 years, actually 17 years and 1 month, 1420 to 1436, and then 1 month in 1979. And the United States, we've never been at peace. All we do is war. And you know what the truth is? We learned it from here. Because the British Empire was the most militarized society imaginable. And unfortunately, the leaders of this country, and it turns out not to matter which party, because Starmer is as bad as Boris Johnson, all they know is military. It's unbelievable. What's the first thing that Starmer does when he becomes prime minister? He goes to Kiev to pledge the endless support of the U.S., by the way, because Britain doesn't do anything, the endless support of the United States to the defeat of Russia. And then he flies across the Atlantic to try to convince Biden to authorize, what authorize means is for the U.S. military to enable deep strikes inside Russia. That's really a clever thing to do, especially because Putin said, well, then we'd be at war with each other and we'd be forced to reconsider our nuclear strategy. And then we have our CIA director in this. This would be great for the West End theater, by the way, because it's a kind of parody. The CIA director meets with the MI6 director on stage recently here and says, oh, don't worry about Putin's bluff. Well, my advice is if you're going to say that before we're all annihilated, because no one's going to hear you after we're all annihilated. How do we know he's bluffing? He's not bluffing if Russia is fundamentally threatened.